Rain had always made the old lakeside house feel smaller. It tapped gently against the windows, rolled across the roof in soft waves, and wrapped the quiet rooms in a peaceful rhythm. Most nights, the sound helped Rowan Mercer fall asleep. Tonight, it pulled him awake. The digital clock beside his bed glowed 2:17 a.m. He lay still beneath the blanket, listening. At first, there was only the rain. Then came another sound, a slow creak from the hallway. It wasn't loud enough to be frightening. It sounded familiar, like someone trying not to wake another person. Rowan frowned. Caleb never stayed awake this late. For as long as they had shared this house, Caleb Foster had followed the same routine. He would drink tea before bed, complain about tomorrow's workload, wish Rowan good night, and disappear behind his bedroom door before midnight. Tonight was different. Rowan slipped quietly from bed and opened his door. The hallway was dark except for a pale strip of moonlight stretching across the wooden floor. Caleb's bedroom door stood open. The room was empty. A strange feeling settled in Rowan's chest. Not fear, curiosity. He moved carefully toward the staircase, avoiding the steps that always groaned beneath his weight. The house smelled faintly of cedar wood and fresh rain drifting through a cracked kitchen window. A soft light glowed downstairs. Rowan stopped halfway. The kitchen lamp had been left on. Its warm golden light spilled into the living room, leaving gentle shadows across the floor. He could hear quiet breathing. Then, a whisper. His own name. Rowan. His heart skipped. He took another careful step until the kitchen doorway came into view. Caleb sat alone at the small wooden table. His elbows rested against the surface while both hands held something close to his chest. Rowan narrowed his eyes. It was an old navy blue hoodie. His hoodie, the one he thought had disappeared weeks ago. Caleb held it carefully, almost as if it were fragile. His eyes were closed. His shoulders trembled ever so slightly. For a long moment he said nothing. Then another whisper escaped. "I miss how things used to feel." The words barely reached Rowan. Caleb pressed the hoodie closer, breathing slowly as though it carried memories instead of fabric. Moonlight slipped through the kitchen window and caught the moisture gathering beneath his eyes. Caleb was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly enough that nobody was ever supposed to know. Rowan froze. In all the years they had known each other, he had never seen Caleb cry. Not when his father moved across the country. Not after college rejections. Not during the hardest winters. Caleb had always smiled first. Always carried everyone else. Always found reasons to laugh. Yet here he sat in complete silence, looking more alone than Rowan had ever imagined possible. Rowan wanted to step inside, to ask what was wrong, to tell him he wasn't alone. Instead, his feet refused to move. Something about the moment felt too private, too honest. Caleb slowly opened his eyes. He stared at the hoodie before letting out a quiet breath. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." The words sounded heavier than the rain outside. Rowan felt his chest tighten. Questions rushed through his mind. Why did Caleb have his hoodie? Why had he hidden it? Why had he whispered his name? Before Rowan could think any further, the floor beneath him creaked. A tiny sound. Barely noticeable, but enough. Caleb looked toward the doorway. His eyes widened. For one frozen second, neither of them moved. Rowan instinctively stepped backward into the darkness before Caleb could fully see him. He heard a chair scrape across the floor. The kitchen drawer opened. Another closed. By the time Rowan quietly returned upstairs, his heartbeat refused to slow. He slipped beneath his blanket and stared at the ceiling. Rain continued falling. His mind refused to rest. Had Caleb really been holding his hoodie? Had he imagined hearing his own name? Every memory from the past few years suddenly felt different. Caleb insisting they watch old movies together. Saving Rowan the last slice of pizza. Remembering little details nobody else noticed. Driving across town during a snowstorm just because Rowan had forgotten his medication. None of those moments had seemed unusual before. Now they refused to leave his thoughts. The house became silent again. Eventually Rowan heard Caleb's bedroom door close. Neither of them slept much after that. Morning arrived hidden beneath gray clouds. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen. When Rowan walked downstairs, Caleb already stood at the stove making pancakes as if nothing unusual had happened. He smiled easily. "Morning." His voice sounded perfectly normal. "Morning," Rowan answered. Their eyes met for only a second. Then both looked away. Breakfast passed with ordinary conversation. Assignments, groceries, weekend plans. Nothing about 2 o'clock in the morning. Nothing about the hoodie. Nothing about tears. Rowan searched Caleb's face for some sign that the night had been real. There wasn't one. Caleb laughed at a joke on television. He poured more coffee. He asked whether Rowan wanted extra syrup. Everything seemed exactly the same. Yet nothing felt the same anymore. After breakfast, Caleb grabbed his backpack. "I'll probably be home late tonight," he said. "Study group." Rowan nodded. "Okay." Caleb hesitated for a heartbeat, almost as though he wanted to say something else. Instead, he smiled politely and walked out the front door. The sound of his truck faded into the rainy morning. Rowan remained standing beside the kitchen table. His eyes drifted toward the chair Caleb had occupied only hours before. The memory returned with painful clarity. The trembling hands. The whispered name. The tears. He quietly opened the hallway closet. Inside hung jackets, scarves, and umbrellas. His old navy blue hoodie was folded neatly on the highest shelf. Exactly where it should have been. Rowan reached for it with uncertain hands. The fabric still carried the faint scent of cedar and coffee. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he wondered if exhaustion had created the entire midnight scene. But deep inside, another feeling refused to disappear. Whatever Caleb had been hiding wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days after that rainy night slipped past with quiet precision. Yet nothing inside the house felt ordinary anymore. From the outside, our lives looked exactly the same. Caleb still left early each morning with a travel mug balanced in one hand. He still greeted the neighbors with his easy smile. He still filled the kitchen with music while making dinner. But I noticed the spaces between those familiar moments. He lingered outside my bedroom before knocking. He stopped himself from saying things that once came naturally. Sometimes I caught him looking at me across the room, only for him to glance away the instant our eyes met. It was as though we had both become actors performing the same friendship, careful not to forget our lines. I wanted to ask him about that night. The words reached my throat countless times. They never reached my lips. Instead, I convinced myself that silence was safer. Silence had protected my feelings for years. Perhaps it could protect our friendship a little longer. One cool Thursday afternoon, I returned home carrying 2 paper bags filled with groceries. Caleb was already there. He stood on the back porch, watching the lake as sunlight shimmered across the water. For a moment, he looked peaceful. Then he heard my footsteps. His shoulders straightened immediately. "You bought too much again," he said with a familiar grin. "I always do." "I'll help." He reached for one of the bags. Our hands brushed for only a second. Neither of us spoke. The smallest touch suddenly carried far more meaning than it ever should have. Inside the kitchen, we unpacked vegetables, bread, coffee, and fruit in complete silence. Normally, we would have joked about my terrible shopping habits or argued over whose turn it was to cook. Instead, every ordinary moment felt strangely fragile. Finally, Caleb cleared his throat. "You've been quiet lately." "So have you." His smile faded. "I guess I've been tired." "Me too." Neither answer was true. Neither of us challenged the other. That evening, after dinner, Caleb disappeared into his room earlier than usual. I remained in the living room, pretending to read while staring at the same page for nearly 20 minutes. The rain had returned. The soft rhythm reminded me of that night. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the image of Caleb holding my hoodie as though it meant something precious. The following weekend brought another change. Noah Bennett came to visit. Noah had known Caleb since high school. He was confident, outgoing, and effortlessly friendly with everyone he met. The moment he walked through our front door, the house felt louder. "There he is," Noah laughed, pulling Caleb into a quick hug. Caleb laughed too. It was genuine. The kind of carefree laugh I hadn't heard from him in weeks. Something tightened inside my chest. I hated the feeling immediately. Noah had done nothing wrong. He was kind to me. He asked about my classes. He remembered my birthday. Still, watching Caleb smile so easily beside him stirred an uncomfortable ache I couldn't explain away. Over the next several days, Noah visited often. Sometimes they left together for coffee. Sometimes they spent hours talking on the porch. Whenever I walked outside, their conversations seemed to stop for just a second before continuing again. I told myself I was imagining it. Yet the distance between Caleb and me continued growing. One evening, Grace Holloway knocked on our door. She lived across the street and had known us since we rented the house. She handed me a plate of homemade cookies with a gentle smile. "You look tired," she said. "I've just been busy." Grace tilted her head. "No." Her voice remained soft. "You look like someone carrying a conversation that never happened." Her words settled heavily inside me. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." She looked toward the lake before speaking again. "Sometimes the people who seem strongest spend the longest time hiding." I followed her gaze. The lake reflected the evening sky like polished glass. "I wish people would just say what they feel," I admitted quietly. Grace smiled sadly. "If only fear worked that way." After she left, I sat alone on the porch until darkness settled over the water. My thoughts drifted backward. I remembered being 12 years old. My mother had been in the hospital after surgery. I had tried to pretend everything was fine. Caleb had appeared at my front door carrying 2 milkshakes. He never asked questions. He simply sat beside me for hours. Neither of us spoke much. His presence had been enough. Years later, when Caleb lost his grandfather, we spent an entire weekend fishing without catching a single fish. Again, words weren't necessary. We had always understood each other without explanations. So when had that changed? When had silence stopped feeling comforting and started feeling lonely? A few nights later, I returned home earlier than expected. The lights in the living room were off. Voices drifted from the kitchen. Caleb and Noah. I wasn't trying to listen. I simply froze when I heard my name. "Rowan doesn't know," Noah said quietly. "I know," Caleb answered. "How much longer are you planning to hide it?" Several seconds passed before Caleb spoke again. "As long as I have to." My heartbeat pounded inside my ears. Hide what? Every terrible possibility rushed through my mind. Was Caleb seeing someone? Had he been protecting another relationship? Had that mysterious night been about someone else entirely? Before I could move away, the kitchen floor creaked beneath my foot. The conversation stopped. A chair scraped softly across the floor. Then Caleb appeared in the doorway. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. His expression wasn't angry. It was frightened, almost pleading, as though he wanted to explain everything but couldn't find the courage to begin. "You just got home?" he asked. I forced a small nod. "Yeah." Noah stepped into view behind him. His easy smile had disappeared. The silence between the three of us felt heavier than any argument. "I should go," Noah said quietly. He grabbed his jacket and slipped past me toward the front door. The sound of it closing echoed through the house. Caleb looked at me. I looked back. 100 questions filled my mind. Not one reached my lips. "I'm tired," I whispered. Then I walked upstairs before he could answer. That night, I lay awake listening to the rain once more. For the first time since we had met as children, I wondered if the person I trusted most had been keeping a life completely hidden from me. And somehow, that possibility hurt even more than the thought that I might never have been enough. The following week, the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a place where two strangers happened to share the same address. Caleb still wished me good morning. I still answered. We still ate dinner at the same table. But every conversation ended before it truly began. The silence between us had become louder than any argument. I stopped lingering in the living room after work. Instead, I stayed in my bedroom with the door half closed, convincing myself I needed the quiet. The truth was much simpler. I was afraid that if I looked at Caleb for too long, I would ask questions I wasn't ready to hear answered. One Saturday morning, I opened my closet and pulled an old cardboard box onto the bed. Then another, and another. I folded my clothes carefully, placing them inside without thinking. The movement gave my restless hands something to do. If I couldn't quiet my heart, perhaps I could at least pack it away. A few minutes later, there was a gentle knock. The door opened before I could answer. Without another word, he walked out. You told him my biggest secret. I know. You had no right. I know. For years, I had believed my feelings were safely buried, hidden, protected. Now I discovered they had never been hidden at all. Caleb had known. All this time, every awkward smile, every avoided conversation, every strange silence, he had known. I stood so quickly that my chair scraped across the floor. I have to go. Rowan. No. I shook my head. I can't do this. Outside, cold wind rushed across the lake. I barely noticed. The only thought echoing inside my mind was the same question over and over. Why hadn't he told me? By the time I reached home, evening shadows stretched across the porch. The front door opened before I reached it. Caleb was waiting. He looked exhausted, as though he hadn't slept in days. You talked to Noah. It wasn't a question. I nodded. You knew. He closed his eyes briefly. Yes. For years. Yes. And you never told me. I didn't know how. Anger rose faster than I could stop it. You let me believe I was protecting our friendship. I was trying to protect it too. No. My voice cracked. You were pretending. I wasn't pretending. You acted like nothing had changed. Because I didn't want to lose you. His words came quickly now, years of buried emotion finally breaking free. I thought if I said anything, you'd leave. I might have. I know. And yet you still kept the truth from me. I didn't know what the right answer was. Neither did I. But that didn't make the hurt disappear. Tears blurred my vision. You should have trusted me. Caleb's own eyes filled. I wanted to. So why didn't you? His voice became almost a whisper. Because I was terrified. The room fell silent. Not peaceful. Broken. I looked at the man who had been my closest friend since childhood. For years, I had imagined betrayal would come from lies. Instead, it had come from fear. Fear had stolen conversations we should have had. Fear had turned honesty into silence. Fear had left us standing on opposite sides of the same room. I can't stay here tonight, I said quietly. Caleb didn't try to stop me. Perhaps he knew he couldn't. I packed a small overnight bag and walked toward the front door. As my hand reached the handle, I paused. Without turning around, I spoke one final sentence. I wish you had trusted me enough to let me choose. Then I stepped outside. Rain had started falling again. Soft. Cold. Endless. Behind me, the porch light remained on. Caleb stood silently in the doorway, watching me disappear into the darkness. Neither of us knew whether this was the end of our story, or the painful beginning of the truth we had spent years avoiding. 3 weeks passed before I returned to the lakeside. Autumn had quietly settled over the town, while I was busy pretending my life had moved forward. The trees along the shoreline glowed with shades of amber and gold. The air carried the sharp scent of fallen leaves instead of summer rain. Everything had changed. Everything except the ache I carried with me. The small apartment near campus was comfortable enough. It had clean walls, large windows, and just enough space for one person. But it never felt lived in. It never sounded like home. There was no familiar music drifting from the kitchen. No teasing voice reminding me that I had forgotten to buy coffee. No quiet footsteps in the hallway late at night. The silence I had wanted now felt unbearably heavy. I buried myself in work. Long evenings at the library became excuses to avoid my own thoughts. Friends invited me out, but I usually declined. Smiling for strangers seemed impossible when I could barely convince myself I was healing. One Saturday afternoon, someone knocked gently on my apartment door. When I opened it, Grace Holloway stood outside with a small cardboard box tucked beneath one arm. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said with her usual gentle smile. "You never do." She stepped inside and placed the box carefully on my kitchen table. "I found this while helping Caleb clean the house." At the sound of his name, my chest tightened. Grace looked at me kindly. "He asked me to donate a few things." She hesitated before continuing. "I think this ended up in the wrong pile." I looked down. Inside the box were old photographs, movie ticket stubs, postcards from road trips, and a worn leather notebook. The notebook immediately caught my attention. My name wasn't written on it. Neither was Caleb's. It looked deeply personal. "I shouldn't read this," I whispered. Grace nodded. "Probably not." She moved toward the door. Then she paused. Sometimes understanding arrives in unexpected ways. After she left, I sat staring at the notebook for several minutes. Every part of me knew it was private. Every part of me also knew I might never understand Caleb if I walked away. With trembling hands, I opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably his. The earliest entries spoke about ordinary things. Work, family, fishing trips, old memories. Then, gradually, the words became heavier. One sentence caught my attention immediately. "I wish feelings came with instructions." I turned another page. "Everyone thinks they know who I am. Sometimes I think they do too." Another. "Rowan smiled today because I fixed his old bicycle. I wanted to tell him that seeing him smile somehow makes difficult days easier." My heartbeat quickened. The entries continued over several years. None of them sounded dramatic. None of them searched for excuses. They simply revealed a man quietly trying to understand himself. I keep telling myself this is only friendship. Then why does losing him scare me more than losing anyone else? He deserves honesty. I just don't know how to give it. Tears blurred the ink beneath my eyes. Every page carried the same quiet struggle. Not denial. Not shame. Fear. Fear of changing the only relationship that had ever made him feel completely safe. Then I reached an entry dated only a month before I moved out. The words made my hands shake. "Tonight I found Rowan's old hoodie while cleaning the closet. It still smells like cedar soap and coffee. Holding it felt like remembering every version of home I've ever known." I whispered his name because saying it aloud was easier than saying it to his face. If he ever knew how confused I am, I think I'd lose him forever. My vision blurred completely. That rainy night. The mystery that had haunted me for weeks. It had never been about another person. It had never been about pretending. It had been about someone sitting alone in the dark, frightened by feelings he didn't know how to name. I closed the notebook carefully. For the first time since leaving the house, I understood something painful. Neither of us had been trying to hurt the other. We had simply been protecting different fears. Mine was rejection. His was losing me. Both fears had led us to the same lonely place. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I looked toward the apartment door. Another knock followed. Slow, uncertain. When I opened it, my breath caught. Caleb stood there. He looked thinner than I remembered. The easy confidence that had always surrounded him seemed quieter now. His hands rested inside the pockets of his jacket as though he wasn't sure what to do with them. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he smiled. A small, nervous smile. "Hi." "Hi." "I wasn't sure you'd answer." "I wasn't sure either." He glanced toward the notebook resting on my table. "I guess Grace came by." I nodded slowly. "I read it." A shadow crossed his face. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For making you carry all of that." He looked down at the floor. "I never wanted you to feel alone." I took a slow breath. "You weren't pretending." He looked up. "No, you were scared." A quiet laugh escaped him. "I've never been more scared of anything." The tension between us softened just enough for honesty to enter. "I thought you pitted me," I admitted. "I never did. I thought you were hiding someone. There was never anyone else. I thought I'd imagined that night." You didn't. Another long silence settled between us. This one felt different. Not empty. Gentle. Caleb finally stepped onto the small balcony outside my apartment. I joined him. Below us, evening lights reflected across the quiet streets. I spent years trying to become someone who never had to ask difficult questions, he said softly. And he smiled sadly. It turns out questions don't disappear just because we ignore them. I looked toward the fading sunset. I spent years believing silence would protect us. It didn't. No, it only protected our fear. For the first time in weeks, we weren't arguing. We weren't defending ourselves. We were simply telling the truth. Neither of us knew exactly what tomorrow would look like. Neither of us rushed to define what we were becoming. But standing together beneath the quiet evening sky, something that had been broken finally began to mend. Not with promises, not with dramatic confessions, only with honesty. And somehow, honesty felt stronger than anything fear had ever built. Winter arrived quietly. The first snow fell before sunrise, covering the lakeside town in a soft blanket of white. From my apartment window, everything looked calmer than it had in months. Life hadn't returned to the way it used to be. Instead, it was becoming something new. After that evening on my balcony, Caleb and I made one simple promise. No more silence. No more pretending that difficult conversations could wait forever. At first, rebuilding our friendship felt awkward. We met for coffee once a week. Sometimes we walked around the frozen lake without saying much. Other times we talked for hours about everything except our feelings. It wasn't because we wanted to avoid them. We were simply learning how to trust each other again. Trust, I realized, returned one honest conversation at a time. One Saturday afternoon, Caleb invited me back to the old house. I made dinner, he said over the phone. I promise I didn't burn anything. I laughed before I could stop myself. It was the first real laugh I had shared with him in weeks. When I arrived, the porch light was glowing against the falling snow. The house looked exactly as I remembered. Warm windows, a familiar welcome mat, the quiet sound of music drifting from inside. For a moment, I simply stood there. This place had witnessed our happiest memories. It had also witnessed our greatest heartbreak. Opening the front door felt like stepping into both at once. Caleb looked up from the kitchen. There you are. His smile was small, real. I almost convinced myself you'd changed your mind. I almost did. He chuckled softly. Fair enough. Dinner wasn't perfect. The pasta was slightly overcooked. The garlic bread spent a little too long in the oven. Neither of us cared. Conversation flowed more naturally than it had in months. We talked about work, books, old road trips, Grace's endless supply of homemade cookies. Even the laughter sounded different now. Gentler. Less forced. After washing the dishes together, we carried 2 mugs of hot chocolate onto the back porch. Snowflakes drifted silently across the lake. The world felt wonderfully still. Caleb rested his elbows against the railing. I've been thinking. That sounds dangerous. He smiled. I deserve that. For a while, he watched the snow without speaking. Then he finally looked at me. I spent years trying to find the right label for what I was feeling. I stayed quiet. I thought if I could explain everything perfectly, nobody would get hurt. He shook his head gently. But feelings don't wait for perfect explanations. I nodded slowly. No, they just ask whether we're willing to be honest. The cold air surrounded us. Yet somehow I had never felt warmer. I should tell you something, I said. He gave me his full attention. I wasn't only afraid of rejection. What else? I was afraid that if you knew the truth, every memory we shared would become uncomfortable. His expression softened. They never were. You didn't feel trapped? No. You never wished I had loved someone else? Caleb looked across the frozen lake before answering. I wished you never had to hide. His words settled quietly inside me. Months ago, hearing them might have broken my heart. Now they helped it heal. He drew a slow breath. The person I kept running from, he paused, was never you. I looked at him. It was myself. Neither of us spoke after that. The silence no longer felt frightening, felt peaceful. A place where words could rest instead of hiding. Carefully, almost uncertainly, Caleb reached out his hand. Not dramatically, not urgently, simply offering it. I looked down for a brief moment. Then I placed my hand in his. Our fingers intertwined naturally. There were no fireworks, no audience, no grand declaration. Just two people who had spent years standing on opposite sides of fear. Now, at last, they stood beside each other. The weeks that followed moved gently. I didn't move back into the house immediately. Neither of us wanted to rush. Some evenings I stayed for dinner. Other nights Caleb visited my apartment carrying takeout and terrible movie recommendations. Grace noticed the change before either of us mentioned it. One afternoon she smiled knowingly as we walked together through the neighborhood. I've been waiting for those smiles to come back. Caleb laughed. They were lost for a while. Grace nodded. The important thing is that you found them. Spring slowly replaced winter. The lake reflected blue skies once more. The trees that had stood bare only months earlier filled with fresh green leaves. Life somehow always found its way back. One warm afternoon, Caleb suggested we visit the small wooden dock where we had spent countless summers as children. We sat side by side with our feet hanging above the water. The breeze carried the familiar scent of pine trees and fresh earth. This was always my favorite place, I said. I know. How? He smiled. You told me when we were 13. You remembered that? I remember almost everything about you. Emotion tightened quietly inside my chest. Not because the words were dramatic, because they were spoken so simply, so honestly. For a long while, we watched sunlight dance across the water. Finally, I broke the silence. Do you ever wish we could erase everything that happened? Caleb considered the question carefully. No. I looked at him, surprised. Not even the painful parts? They hurt. He nodded. They always will. Then why? Because they taught us something. What? He smiled, the same gentle smile that had welcomed me home that snowy evening. Love doesn't survive because life is easy. He squeezed my hand softly. It survives because two people choose honesty before fear. The wind rippled across the lake. I thought back to that rainy night when I had quietly watched him holding my old hoodie in the kitchen. At the time, I believed I had witnessed the beginning of the end. Now I understood what I had truly seen. Not the end. The first fragile moment when the walls around two frightened hearts had finally begun to crack. Healing had taken months. Trust had taken patience. Forgiveness had taken courage. But every difficult step had led us here. To a quiet afternoon. To peaceful silence. To hands still gently intertwined. Sometimes love arrives like a storm. Sometimes it arrives like sunlight after rain. Ours arrived slowly, almost unnoticed, through ordinary conversations, quiet forgiveness, and the courage to tell the truth. Looking across the shimmering lake, I realized home had never been a place. Home had always been the person willing to stay beside me once the silence was finally broken. And this time, neither of us planned to let fear speak louder than love again.